Hey everyone, what's up? The MSI Titan 18HX is a monster. Or well, actually it is a Titan, yeah. And by far the most expensive laptop I've ever had on my desk. This thing is absolute top tier. As it sits here, oh by the way, I hope you're sitting, it costs around $6,000. For that you get the fastest CPU currently available in a Windows laptop. The Intel Core Ultra 9 285HX with 24 cores. We'll take a closer look at that in a minute. On top of that, you also get the fastest laptop GPU in the form of the RTX 5090 Mobile, which here is allowed to pull the full 150 watt plus 25 watt dynamic boost. Then we've got 64GB of DDR5 5600 megatransfer RAM and 6TB of SSD storage. In this case made up of 3 2TB SSDs in an exclusive RAID 5 setup. And you could even put in a fourth M.2 SSD if you wanted. There's also an 18-inch 16x10 4K mini LED display, which for some reason has neither G-Sync nor Adaptive Sync. And honestly, at this price point, I find that kinda ridiculous. Doesn't make sense to me. Personally, I'd value that way higher than the mini LED part, if that's what they sacrificed. But before we check out the rest of the Titan 18HX, we gotta talk more about the Intel Core Ultra 9 285HX. This is the fastest CPU for Windows laptops in pretty much every benchmark. And since the 24 cores inside this machine can actually be fed with 200 to 210 watt steadily, it's even a bit faster in here than usual. Yeah, you heard that right, 200 watts. Even sustained, as long as you set the fans to maximum in extreme performance mode. Even though hardware info showed me light thermal throttling with the CPU running at around 100 degrees Celsius in a room temp of around 22 degrees Celsius. The official maximum here is 105 degrees Celsius, by the way. In balanced mode, whether the fan is maxed out or set to auto, and therefore much quieter, it'll start at 200 watts and then drop down to still very high 140 watt, without thermal throttling. The 400 watt power supply can pull up to 200 watt from the wall. If you max out the RTX 5090 Mobile with MSI Combustor and then hit the Core Ultra 9 285HX with Cinebench R24 at the same time, the GPU uses its full 175 watt and the CPU is limited to about 100 watt. While doing so, the PSU gets maxed out at 400 watt for a bit and then drops down to around 370 watt. I also noticed that in extreme performance mode, the laptop slowly drains the battery while gaming on extreme performance mode, about 7% per hour in Cyberpunk 2077. Alright, now let's get into the benchmarks. In Cinebench 2024, insane 2,358 multi-core points and 139 single-core points. In Cinebench R23, again insane, 41,262 for the multi-core and 2,201 for the single-core test. And according to Notebook Check, that's faster than basically all modern desktop CPUs aside from Threadrippers. It even beats a desktop Ryzen 9 9955HX. That's crazy. Intel really clawed their way back onto the top, at least in laptops. And it's impressive that MSI manages to cool a 200 watt CPU inside an 18-inch laptop thanks to a vapor chamber heat pipe system. In Geekbench 6, I saw a single core score of 3,184 and 22,497 for the multi-core test. In PC Mark 10, a strong 8,799 points overall. 23,927 in 3D Mark Time Spy, 6,304 in Speedway, 6,162 in Steel Nomad, and 43,785 in Firestrike. All absolute top numbers for a gaming laptop. In the Blender benchmark, it scored an impressive 8,195 points, and thanks to the 24GB of VRAM, no project is too big here. In the Puget Systems benchmark for Adobe Premiere Pro, it reached a crazy 15,273 points and also a very high 8,821 in Adobe Photoshop. But before we are looking at the gaming benchmarks, let's check out the Titan 18HX itself a bit more closely. The laptop alone weighs 3.6 kilogram. The charger another 850 gram, and together that's 4.4 kilogram. And with its 18 inches, it's obviously quite huge and 3.2 centimeters thick. Still, the clean design at the front, the sides and the top keeps it from looking too bulky. The chassis is made from a black magnesium aluminum alloy. Very solid overall, and the build quality across the board is excellent. It just feels premium. The SteelSeries keyboard with Cherry MX ultra low profile switches is mechanical everywhere except for the numpad, the arrow keys and the function keys. And it feels absolutely fantastic. Hands down, the best laptop keyboard I've ever tested, period. It's just a joy to type on. Plus, it's fully RGB customizable for each key via the SteelSeries software, and of course comes with a full numpad. Now we have to talk about the lit up, very fancy looking touchpad. Unfortunately, it's by far the worst touchpad I've ever used. Seriously, I'd rather take a tiny old touchpad from a decade-old $200 junk laptop. Who came up with this? I really tried to get used to the edgeless design, but no. Clicks often don't register, fast clicking only works in some spots, and you constantly need to lift your finger off the pad completely to register a second click. Absolute F-grade for this touchpad. Now considering the port selection. The left side has two USB 3.2 and an SD card reader. The right side offers two USB-C ports with Thunderbolt 5 and DisplayPort 2.1 plus power delivery, another USB 3.2 port and a 3.5mm audio jack. At the back side we're getting the PSU port, HDMI 2.1 and a 2.5 gigabit LAN port. Nothing to complain about, everything you need is here. The large 18-inch mini-LED display has a 16:10 ratio and a resolution of 3840 by 2400, so actually 11% more pixels than standard 4K. The maximum brightness, a really solid 710 nits with deep blacks thanks to mini-LED. HDR mode pushes the brightness up to around 1100 nits. Color coverage is also excellent with 100% sRGB and P3 plus 90% for Adobe RGB. But be aware, the Titan 18HX is also sold with lower res IPS panels, so not all models have this screen. As expected, battery life isn't amazing with such a powerful CPU and its high idle draw, plus the big screen, even with the maximum allowed 99 Wh battery. About 11.5 hours on idle at 20% display brightness in battery saving mode. Almost 5 hours watching YouTube at 50% brightness and headphones at 20% volume. And about 1 hour and 45 minutes for gaming in Cyberpunk 2077, while the performance drops significantly doing so. The 4 speakers get pretty loud and sound good, but considering the price, I'd like a bit more depth and bass. You can open the Titan 18HX for an upgrade by undoing 12 Phillips head screws and fiddling a bit to get inside. And there you can install up to 4 M.2 SSDs, 3x Gen 4 and 1x Gen 5. The 2 RAM sticks can also be swapped, as well as the battery and the Wi-Fi/Bluetooth module. The MSI Titan 18HX offers the typical MSI laptop software with the well-known fan and performance modes, extreme performance for a maximum performance at around 58 dB with the option to adjust the fan curve or overclock the GPU. The still very fast but much quieter balanced mode at around 51 dB, where unfortunately adjusting the fans isn't possible, and here once again the request to MSI to unlock the fan curve for this mode as well. And there is the Eco Silent mode, which throttles the CPU performance massively to 15 watt and thus strongly and noticeably limits performance even for everyday use, even with light tasks. In return, the fans sometimes switch off completely here. Also, the BIOS is insanely detailed if you unlock the advanced options. Basically, it's like on a desktop PC. And now let's take a look at 5 games on the MSI Titan 18HX with the RTX 5090 Mobile and the Intel Core Ultra 9 285HX at the end. I recorded all the games externally in standard 4K with the extreme performance mode running, since my capture card actually doesn't support the slightly higher resolution of the laptop screen. So first up, as so often, is Cyberpunk 2077, which I tested with 3 different settings, so don't skip. First, ultra settings in 4K with DLSS transformer on quality, and I'd recommend using DLSS either way, since in quality mode the game actually looks even better than on native 4K. Without frame chan, this ran at an average of over 60 FPS with very good 1% lows. With 4K and ray tracing on Ultra, I then set DLSS to balanced, which still looks great on the 18-inch monitor. Here I also enabled frame gen by 2, which in my opinion is still quite playable in Cyberpunk, even with relatively low base FPS. But that's very individual, and some people are very sensitive when it comes to input lag. On the other hand, the game just looks absolutely stunning this way, and I had 87 FPS on average, with the 1% lows here basically matching the base FPS without frame chan. And finally, the overkill with ray tracing on Ultra plus path tracing and ray reconstruction. Here, even with the RTX 5090 Mobile, I had to use DLSS performance, which still looks good, especially on an 18-inch laptop screen compared to desktop monitors. And for once, I set frame gen to by 4 to get a truly smooth image. That gave me 141 FPS on average with naturally quite low real 1% lows, but honestly, I think I could actually get used to playing the game like this. For GTA 5 Enhanced, I again tested with the maximum settings, including ray tracing on Ultra with DLSS on quality. Looks amazing and runs very well with 88 FPS on average and 62 FPS for the 1% lows. There would still be some room for a few graphic mods or alternatively, of course, way more FPS with lower settings. The CPU definitely still had some headroom there. Also impressive how cool both the CPU and the GPU stayed in this game. Overall, a very good gaming experience, but no surprise on probably the fastest gaming laptop in the world, if you don't count exotic water-cooled builds. In Helldivers 2, I also tested 4K with ultra settings and ultra quality upscaling, which surprisingly doesn't use much VRAM. That gave me 74 FPS on average with 1% lows of around 60, and it was playable even in firefights. However, I did have some nasty short freezes here and there, which is obviously really annoying in combat. And after my test, the game actually froze up so badly that I had to restart the laptop. At the end of the day, though, that could just be the game or the drivers, since I never experienced that issue in my other testings. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 also looks fantastic at 4K with ultra settings and DLSS transformer on quality. And the same thing applies here. With DLSS, it's actually sharper and crispier than without anti-aliasing. No joke. 71 FPS on average with 1% lows of 58 FPS. Very playable and very stutter-free. Yeah, it's not 120 FPS, I know, but if you need more, you can easily set DLSS a bit more aggressively. Personally though, I'm totally fine with these FPS numbers. In 4K that just looks gorgeous. And finally, CS2, and yeah, I know, normally you don't play this at 4K with maxed out settings, but I just wanted to see what happens. And in a match against bots on Dust 2, it actually managed a very playable 210 FPS on average with 1% lows of 132. Since the screen only supports 120 Hz, you still get screen tearing, of course. Though I'm aware that input lag continues to drop even with FPS above the refresh rate. So I also tested it at 1080p or Full HD with low settings. That gave me an average of 454 FPS and 1% lows of 152. At that point we are clearly in professional territory, and probably only an AMD X3D CPU could beat that in a laptop.
So all in all, the MSI Titan 18HX is a brutal gaming laptop with the fastest hardware you can currently buy. The Intel Core Ultra 9 285HX and the RTX 5090 Mobile. And MSI charges a hefty price for it. But considering the disastrous touchpad, the missing G-Sync and the poor battery life, despite all the positives, in my opinion, it does leave at least a bit of a bad taste. Of course, it's still an insanely good laptop, especially if you mainly use it stationary with an external mouse or controller. One more note, if you don't really need the 24GB of VRAM of the 5090, then the RTX 5080 version will also do the job. Though with the 4K display here, that's something to at least think about. In my tests, however, I haven't yet had a single game that used more than 60 GB of VRAM, at least not with the settings that I was using. And that's all for today. If you've enjoyed the content, feel free to leave a like, or better yet, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye bye and tschüss.